I'm going to share with you the answers to the homework questions which we gave you on the first worksheet. This was to fill the gap during the time that we couldn't meet face to face. And I know a few people have a difficulty with Zoom and that kind of thing, or Teams. I've just been on a team meeting. The first question we asked was about King Jeroboam. So remember, when the kingdoms divided, Rehoboam went to Judah, which housed Jerusalem, and Jeroboam went in the other direction. He led the northern kingdom, which was the 10 tribes that went first into idolatry and then became known later as the 10 lost tribes after they were taken into captivity by the Assyrians. So how and why did King Jeroboam lead the 10 tribes into idolatry? Remember that proper worship had not been very long established. Most of the priests went to the northern kingdom initially, and then quite a few returned. They were a little bit mobile. Many of them were found living in Bethlehem at a much later date. But there were sufficient priests in Jerusalem to have rightful worship. And King Jeroboam was not interested in any kind of rightful worship. He was going to establish his own worship. He was going to retain the familiar aspects of religion and worship without the inspired power of prophets and priests. And so as we go on with the Minor Prophet study, you'll see that there were plenty of prophets that went down or arose in the northern kingdom, bringing God's warning against idolatry and false worship. But King Jeroboam was doing his own thing in his own way. So the familiar aspects were what the people wanted. They needed to feel that there was continuity in their lives. And some of the things that were familiar were things like community, identity, a sense of belonging. So, you know, the average Jewish person, one of the members of any of the 10 tribes, their sense of who they were in the world was very much entwined with religion and worship. And so he offered a substitute. It was a substitute kingdom, and it was intended to seduce the people into following him. He knew that if they went back to Jerusalem and they were offered opportunities, the people in Jerusalem said, come on, come and worship with us, you know, you're our brothers, you know. And Jeroboam thought, no, if they go back in that direction, they may follow the leadership of Rehoboam, that king. So he seduced them into following him through false worship. And despite the prophetic encounter that had promised him the 10 tribes, he didn't turn to God, but he depended on human wisdom. And so what was happening was that the vast majority of the Jews at that time were being led into an idolatrous and false kind of worship by someone who simply was more concerned about his own leadership role than God's plan for the world. Question 2 was about John 4:20-21, which is the story about the woman of the well, the woman at the well, who asked Jesus about Mount Gerizim. And the question is, why? Why did she bring this business up about Mount Gerizim? And we hear a lot of stories about the Samaritans and how the Samaritans were worse than Gentiles or dogs. They were considered the lowest of the low. And that was because they were like first cousins to everyone living in Judea, but their worship was completely corrupt. So Mount Gerizim was a really important site, and so the Samaritans felt they were justified, not just justified, but they felt it was the right place for them to worship. It was the site of a temple that had been dedicated to Yahweh, and it existed at the same time as the second temple in Jerusalem, although it was destroyed about 112 years before Jesus' incarnation on earth. So why did they choose this particular place? Well, there's a tremendously interesting set of stories in Deuteronomy 27, particularly between verses 11 and 13. And I've often thought that this story could be almost a prophetic one, but it's not told as though it's a prophetic story. So go in and read Deuteronomy 27. It was at a time when Moses divided the tribes up and sent a group to each of these opposing or opposite mountains, one of which, Mount Gerizim, they would pronounce the blessings, and the other they would pronounce the curses. And this was about the covenant. It was about becoming God's people. It was about entering into the Holy Land and establishing the nation that God intended to have in the Promised Land. So you need to go and read it for yourself and have a bit of a think about it. Now, in some places it will say that it was Mount Ebal, but the evidence of people who go digging up cities is that it definitely was Mount Gerizim. There were various stones that had to be placed there according to the ritual that was established. Many of them were inscribed in different ways, and so there was evidence left behind of what had gone on in that mountain and what continued to go on over time. So despite the idolatry of many Samaritans, and despite their lack of worship that was pleasing to God, and despite their lack of priests and leaders, many Samaritans were true seekers. They were seeking Yahweh. They were worshipping Yahweh. They may have been worshipping a few other things, but they were people who were God seekers. So when the woman spoke to Jesus and said to him, well, where are we meant to be worshipping? And it's often presented as just a kind of intellectual argument that she was making to avoid the real issues. But the chances are that she was a God seeker. And so when Jesus eventually gave her the answer, he said to her, true worship wasn't about place. He said, those who worship me will worship in spirit and in truth. Another story that you need to read for yourself and read it carefully to draw out the whole of the allegory that Jesus creates before he makes this wonderful statement. So the historical tension between the Samaritans and the Judeans created confusion for the ordinary truth seeker. And this sinful woman showed how much she knew about the expected Messiah and how eager she was to be free of her past life. All of her actions, all of her reception of Jesus show us what kind of a person she was under that layer of sinfulness. So that was the second question. And here is the third question. So the third question is, what do we learn about spiritual leadership from Jeroboam? So King Jeroboam led from his own authority. He did not offer God's vision and purpose to the people. Yahweh's plan and purposes were not Jeroboam's agenda. And of course, God established prophets, priests, and kings to serve his purposes, to lead his people into his agenda. And the fact that the people never seemed to be able to follow the instructions has been an obstacle throughout history and probably continues to be as the Lord tries to lead the church today and it goes off in a million different directions. So although Jeroboam had received prophetic promises from God, he continued to utilize the charismatic gift of leadership that had caused people to follow him before the kingdom was divided. So if you remember, Jeroboam was on the staff of the old King Solomon, and King Solomon trusted him. But as Jeroboam began to get influence, get authority, and finally get a revelation from God that he was going to be leading 10 tribes, Solomon lost confidence. And so eventually Solomon's own son, Rehoboam, and Jeroboam not being a son, these two men with these very similar names were at odds with one another, and the kingdom was torn asunder through their competition. Okay, so the main thing we learned from this is about cults, because the Samaritans were, above all else, a cult. It was a cultic religion. It was a distillation of different ideas, bits of idolatry, bits of gods worshipped in other nations around them, things made of gold and a bit of Yahweh thrown in for good purposes. Every cult has similarities. And cults, above all else, offer the familiar and comforting aspects of identity, community, security, and acceptance. And these feel-good things that people get from cultic leadership binds them in to authoritarian leadership. So these people at some point have been made to feel very good about themselves. They feel as though they're working for a purpose. There's a sense of involvement and belonging, and then that leads easily into the servitude that authoritarian leaders create. There's an old saying that people don't remember your words, but they do remember how you made them feel. And many people that go into cults at the beginning felt very good. They were made to feel very good about themselves and about what was happening in the group. And before they know it, they're caught in the trap. So only God's kingdom offers true identity and purpose. Charismatic leaders might create an attractive place of worship to entice people, but ultimately, a shallow person who is not sacrificing their own plans for God's purpose will not provide spiritual nourishment to sustain a community. And so we do see charismatic leaders building very big gatherings of people. And it's very difficult, when you're in something that's big and things are happening and everything seems to be going on very well, it's very hard to step back from it and wonder why you feel a sense of dissatisfaction or a lack of fulfillment. And that in a spiritual environment, what is not being fulfilled is God's call upon your life, the call to holiness, the call to mission, the call to ministry, to participation. Because in these kind of environments, you may be led and you may give, but you may not lead. And that this picture actually fulfills what was prophesied from the very time that way back. The people of Israel said, "Give us a king." And Samuel said, "This is what a king will do. He will take, he will take, he will take. He will make you his servants." And so we learn a lot about spiritual leadership from Jeroboam, because it's a perfect picture of the development of a cult that serves its leader and doesn't serve God. That's all we have for now.